In the vast dark and cold expanses between the stars, there are planets that drift alone through the darkness. Planets with no stars to cling to, planets that have never seen a sunrise, alone and isolated. The existence of these wandering celestial bodies was long considered impossible, or at least exceptional. Because until about 20 years ago, all the exoplanets we had discovered orbited around one or more stars. And then we found a small number of bodies that never had any. Worlds without a sun, drifting alone, lost in the immensity of space with no ball of gas to orbit around. These famous rogue planets. Until very recently, only a few dozen of these orphan worlds had been identified at most. And for the most part, by indirect detection methods. And then, last year, by closely examining a single cluster of about 4,000 young stars, nearly 100 of these wandering planets were identified. All of them are much more massive than the gas giant Jupiter, but also extremely young and still hot on the surface. If you could stand in front of one of them, your modest human eyes would probably see little more than a dark disk, barely outlined against the background of the starry sky. Yet, observing such an exoplanet in the infrared would immediately reveal its internal activity in a completely different way. Because all these gas giants drifting alone in the cosmos have stored enough energy in their core during their formation to give the cloud layers of their outer shell a temperature much higher than that inside a nebula, and thus become faint sources of radiation that can be observed in the infrared spectrum. And it's precisely because the power of a planet's inner heat is linked to its mass that we can often only hope to directly observe gas giants, which today make up almost all of the known rogue planets. So, if the detection of low-mass wandering bodies is so rare, it may be above all because they are extremely difficult to see. But despite everything, it is believed that we have recently discovered a planet moving through the darkness of interstellar space, not gravitationally bound, and most importantly, with a mass comparable to that of our own planet. Let's take a moment to imagine this world drifting through the vast cold of space without any star nearby to provide warmth. Here, this body left on its own is far too small to have an internal heat source capable of warming its surface by itself, which has seen its temperature inexorably drop to minus 270 degrees Celsius. And yet, even though the fate of this frozen planet might seem depressing, it could very well be that this type of wandering celestial body could theoretically hold a splendid secret. Even if everything here on the surface, including the atmosphere, has ended up freezing, in reality this world still has a small source of heat, the one hidden in its core. And what if this world is richly endowed with water then? Its frozen desert could harbor, beneath the surface, behind several dozen kilometers of ice, liquid oceans. Just like those that might exist in our solar system, inside the moons Enceladus, Europa, and Ganymede. By digging deep into this armor, acting as an insulator, we might eventually come across pockets of liquid water, small oceans, whose presence would be made possible by the internal energy released by the planet. Because even after being lost for millions of years in the vastness of interstellar space, these adrift planets are not completely cooled down. Consider that even though 99.97% of our world's energy budget comes from the sun alone, a small 0.03% is still provided by our own planet, and this has been the case since its formation. This energy comes mainly from the inner core, a ball of liquid metal that is, at its center, hotter than the surface of the sun, and which slowly releases its heat to the upper layers. And that's how you could potentially make a planet, originally abandoned and left in interstellar space without the nurturing warmth of a parent star, hospitable. Because in these dark depths of sunless realms, it's easy to imagine the presence of something we already find, buried under kilometers of black water on our own planet. Namely, geysers, hydrothermal vents releasing some of the excess internal energy and spewing a burning mineral-rich fluid rising up from the depths of the planet. And while we're at it, why not suppose that here too, in these seemingly hostile conditions, the emergence of life was possible, just as it already thrives on Earth. And that clinging to these hot springs, oases flourish, populated by organisms drawing their energy directly from the minerals and the heat emitted by these hydrothermal vents, and not depending at all on a sun, which in any case doesn't exist here, to survive. It's strange to think that these hypothetical species, if they exist, whether they're microscopic, unicellular, or much more complex organisms, could thrive here, in the stable environments of these deep and dark waters, as long as the heart of the planet remains geologically active. And all the while forever trapped between, above, a glass ceiling made of kilometers of impassable ice, and below, rock, hard and growing ever hotter the deeper you go. Because these living beings would be both protected here by a thick layer of ice from asteroids, gamma rays, and the cold of space, but also trapped, forever isolated from the rest of the universe. Indeed, no matter how intelligent these hypothetical extraterrestrial species might be, these living beings evolving in these ocean pockets will almost certainly never get their hands on wood, oil, or coal. They will never domesticate fire. You can't control flames without combustion, especially when you live in water. So, how could they ever imagine one day being able to make metal tools to try to break the ice? So, it's possible that beneath the surface of these types of worlds, in the depths of rogue planets, there are strange exotic forms of life, trapped with no way of knowing it, and living their lives unaware of the existence of an outside world. From then on, their world would represent for them the entirety of the universe. And then, inexorably, over the course of billions of years passing by, at the center, the core of their planet continues to cool. The layer of ice keeps getting a little thicker, until one day everything ends up completely frozen. In fact, it's easy to imagine that some of these worlds, so cold on the surface that they're almost impossible to distinguish from the blackness of the surrounding space, frequently pass silently near our solar system, and we wouldn't even notice. With intelligent life forms trapped inside them, unaware that they are living inside a planet that is impossible to leave. If the fire beneath the ice of these celestial bodies has finally died out, then some of these rogue planets might contain the drifting remains of a long-extinct civilization, but also perfectly preserved, as if naturally cryogenized, forever trapped in an icy coffin beneath the surface. And if you say that there's always hope that by sheer luck, the trajectory of these petrified planets might one day bring them to pass close enough to stars to be captured and thus begin a new bright chapter of their existence, then you might be disappointed, because unfortunately for these worlds, the chances of being saved from the gloom of interstellar space like this are extremely slim. On the one hand, the space between stars is so vast that there is a greater chance of two randomly fired bullets colliding in the air than of one of these bodies passing close enough to a star to be captured. Most of these drifting worlds travel at around 10 million kilometers per hour. As for the fastest of these solitary planets, they move through space 35 times faster than stars typically orbit around the galactic center. And it's partly these considerable speed differences between the stars and these planets that make any capture event extremely unlikely. So, are these silent worlds doomed in their wild solitary journeys around the galactic center to overtake millions of stars for billions of years until the last of them goes out? In reality, the only way to put an end to this wandering would be to see it come to a sudden stop, following a highly unlikely collision with other hypothetical bodies gravitationally bound to stars. Still, as things stand, in the absence of the spotlight of stars to reveal them, these rocky and frozen planets are very difficult to detect, and only those that are relatively massive and warm on the surface remain directly detectable. Here is a real image taken in the infrared range. It shows what is still the closest rogue planet to the solar system discovered to date. This small dot, this faint blue glow at the center of the image, is a gas giant located 130 light-years away from us. And it's 5 to 15 times more massive than Jupiter. And even though it doesn't have any stars, it still has a surface temperature of nearly 400 degrees C. Studying this type of world should allow us to learn much more about the processes of planet formation in the future. These celestial bodies, now left to themselves in the freezing cold of space, did they ever know the warmth and light of a star? As it stands, we still don't know, for example, whether all the drifting gas giants we've talked about formed like stars within stellar nurseries from huge collapsing clouds of gas, not having had time to accumulate enough matter to ignite, and would therefore be, in a way, failed stars, having formed on their own and always having been so. or if these planets were born within disks of dust surrounding stars during the first millions of years of their existence, and were ejected from them by gravitational interactions. It is believed that, during the early phases of their existence, planetary systems can be dangerous and turbulent environments in which protoplanets, driven by orbital resonances, engage in a constant struggle before finally finding their point of equilibrium. In this chaotic and complex dance where trajectories are disrupted, the forming gas giants, with their immense mass, can disrupt the fragile gravitational balance that is still being established, and push weaker planets to the point of ejecting them from their cradles, thus contributing to populating the cosmos with drifting bodies. It is even possible that planets orbiting on the outskirts of systems could be torn away by the gravitational influence caused by the passage of massive stars nearby. It's actually amusing to think that our own system was surely the scene of this during its formation. 4.6 billion years ago, these dangerous games of influence took place, to the point that we may have lost one or even several of these planets. There are many possibilities, and a lot of makes. In fact, if there are so many of them, it's because it's extremely difficult to trace the exact history and the conditions in which these drifting worlds were formed, while millions or even billions of years have passed since their birth. Still, based on the number of these objects we've been able to detect in the small portions of the sky we've observed, it's estimated that our Milky Way alone could host between 2 and 3 billion of them. So, these worlds that may have once seemed particularly unlucky to us actually appear to be extremely common. And to find out whether these few billion worlds drifting alone in the cosmos are collateral damage ejected after the formation of planetary systems, or if they formed on their own by the collapse of small clouds in the interstellar medium, we will need to study them in more detail in the future. Maybe even those that are solid and covered with ice hold within them part of the answer to this troubling question. Is the appearance of life just a lucky accident that can only happen when all the conditions are perfectly aligned? Or is it that as soon as you have water supplied with energy, that's enough for it to appear? And if despite everything you still find these wandering celestial bodies a bit depressing, here are 2 reasons that suggest after all, their fate might actually be a little enviable. First of all, there are situations that could be considered worse, since a very small number of wandering planets, still unidentified, might be drifting through space between galaxies. In fact, it is believed that the ejection of planets is a relatively common phenomenon during the early stages of planetary system formation. So, when these form on the outskirts of galaxies, a small number of those that are catapulted could be given an escape trajectory that sends them hurtling into intergalactic space, making them planets that wander alone in the emptiest regions of our universe, regions that stretch between galaxies over millions of light years. There, the already slim hope of encountering another solar system is now literally reduced to nothing. And above all, it's believed that, in the end, it's simply time that should eventually overcome the stability of all systems. In other words, each of these wandering planets is, in a way, a preview of what inevitably awaits us. Because every planet that has a star today will one day be doomed to lose it. And if it reassures you, this phenomenon shouldn't begin for something like a quadrillion years, long after the very last stars in the universe have gone out. It is believed that then, the ongoing play of gravitational disturbances and the passage of time will eventually overcome the stability of all orbits, to the point of tearing 90% of planets away from their systems, ejecting them into space. Great, an even greater number of rogue planets. The next time you watch a sunset, think about the billions of planets that are deprived of it. To those that once knew the daylight from a star, from which they were torn away, as well as those whose surface temperature dropped so much that even the atmosphere eventually fell, by freezing and settling on the ground, thus helping to form a single desert of ice covering the entirety of these worlds, desolate, but perhaps hiding something deep inside. And don't forget to go check out Displayed, if only because it's a feast for the eyes. Honestly, it's worth the visit. Since my room is part of the universe, there's no reason not to bring some of it inside. For more cosmic content and other mind-bending stuff, follow me on Insta. You can also support me on Utip or Typee.